Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope that everybody can hear me. Yes, I have a nod. Thank you very much. Welcome to this session, which is Matter 7G, still on site allocations, and it's the rural villages looking specifically at Kelvedon, Hatch and Blackmore. Now, before I go any further, I'll just quickly introduce myself, because there may be a couple of faces I may not recognise. My name's Yvonne Wright, and I'm one of the inspectors who's been charged with examining the legal compliance and soundness of this plan. And the other inspector is Mr. Warden. So, Mr. Warden, would you like to just say hello to everybody?
Good afternoon, everybody.
Thank you. I'm not going to give any more housekeeping matters. I think that's been explained to you. Excuse me. By Ms. Feeney. So can I move directly on to introductions for the participants, please? Just so I know that I've got everybody in the room. Can I start with the Borough Council, please?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tor Shadarevian QC, acting for the Council.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Inspector Phil Drain, Director of Planning and Economy at Brentwood Council.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Inspector Jonathan Quilter, Strategic Planning Manager at Brentwood Council.
Good morning, Inspectors. It's Tom Huang, Senior Policy Planner at Brentwood Borough Council.
Thank you. And then do I have a representative from Crest Nicholson, please?
Afternoon, Inspector. Yeah, Ben Thomas here from Savills, representing Crest in relation to parcel R26, land north of Orchard Piece in Blackmore.
Thank you. I know that Essex County Council aren't here with us today, so I'll move on to Constable Holmes, please.
Good afternoon, Madam. My name is Richard Turney, T-U-R-N-E-Y, barrister, and I'm instructed on behalf of Constable Holmes Limited, and our concern is R25 in Blackmore.
Thank you.
And I'm Stephen Butler from Bidwells, also on behalf of Constable Holmes, here to provide assistance to Richard Turney if required.
Thank you. And Blackmore Parish Council and Blackmore Village Heritage Association, please.
Good afternoon all. My name is David Whipps. I'm a solicitor and I represent the Blackmore, Hook End and Whites Green Parish Council and the Blackmore Village Heritage Association.
So you're here on behalf of those two organisations then? Yes, you're representing both. Lovely. Thank you. And Stonebond Properties, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andy Butcher. I'm from Stratton Parker, planning consultant for Stonebond. Joining us in the virtual room, we also have Paul Gibbs from David Jarvis Associates, who is here to respond to issues or questions that may arise on Greenbelt matters, and I'll pull him in as and when and if necessary, Mum, if that's okay.
Okay. Great, thank you. Is there anybody else in the virtual room that I haven't? No, brilliant. Thank you very much. I would like to, if there's no sort of questions about how we're going to run this session this afternoon, I would like to start with Blackmore rather than starting with Kelvedon Hatch. So I would like to consider the policies for R25 and R26 first, please. So following similar vein to the site allocation discussions that were that happened this morning, could the council just provide a very short introduction to those sites? You can do them individually. They've been just put together in our MIQs because it just assisted, because they would have been the same questions asked about the sites, etc. But I'm happy to separate them out as individual policies dealing with individual sites, obviously. So if the council can just do a short introduction to the sites, but then set out what exceptional circumstances you consider are there to justify the removal of the sites from the Greenbelt, please.
Thank you, Inspector. So in terms of the two proposed sites within Blackmore, we have sites R25, which is land north of Willard Way, and R26, which is land north of Orchard Peace. In terms of dealing with the R25 site first, so as set out in the addendum of focus changes, the quantum of development on the site is anticipated to be 30 dwellings, and the site is situated to the north of the village of Blackmore. As obviously the site name sets out, it's north of existing residential development along Willard Way. It's also bounded by Nine Ashes Road to the west, Fingriff Hall Lane to the east, and Red Rose Lane to the north, and represents a contained parcel. In terms of the exceptional circumstances, the development of the sites were assessed in, or site was assessed in the Greenbelt study as having a moderate impact on Greenbelt. Residential development at this site is considered to be appropriate due to the location of the site adjacent to the village of Blackmore. Development would not be expected to go further north than Red Rose Lane, which contains the site. Due to the site being contained and of relatively small size, these would not lead to any coalescence with other towns or villages, with separation being maintained. The allocation for residential dwellings in this location is considered therefore to be appropriate. In terms of the site R26, so land north of Orchard Peace, so again, there's existing residential development to the south along Orchard Peace, and the site is bounded by the Fingriff Hall Lane on the western boundary, Red Rose Lane to the north, and there's a field boundary on the eastern boundary of the site, so then sort of land in between that edge of the site and Chelmsford Road. In terms of the exceptional circumstances, very much similar to what I've said for the R25 site, but I'll read that out again. So development of the site of R26 again was assessed in the Greenbelt study as having moderate impact on the Greenbelt, and the residential development of this site is considered to be appropriate due to its location adjacent to the village of Blackmore. Development would not be expected to go further north than Red Rose Lane, which contains the site. And due to it being contained and of relatively small size, it would not lead to any coalescence of other towns or villages, with separation being maintained. And therefore, the allocation for residential dwellings is considered to be appropriate in this location. Sorry.
No, that's fine. And this is in the submitted plan as set out in the focus changes. This is for 20 dwellings. Is that correct?
Yeah, sorry, I was about to come on to that. Yeah, apologies, I missed that. Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. Yeah. Just wanted to ensure that that is all correct. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that, Mr. Quilter. What I'd like to start off with is just an understanding of the reasoning behind these sites being allocated in relation to the council's strategy, before then moving to look at more specifics on the site in relation to capacity and deliverability and other aspects of that. So could the council just run through the process or the approach and thinking that the council had in bringing forward these developments on the edge of Blackmore, please?
Thank you, Inspector. So obviously relating back to the spatial strategy for the plan, principally, obviously development is identified on those transport corridors on the Brentwood Transport Corridor and the southern Brentwood Transport Corridor. In terms of the approach that the plan's taken to villages, obviously there's been a consideration of the need to accommodate development in all locations. So there's by no means has that been ignored. And obviously the assessment process, as we outlined yesterday, was looking at all of the available and achievable sites on the boundaries of those villages. And in terms of the assessment of the sites in Blackmore in particular, there were many others that were proposed very much around the entire surroundings of Blackmore, but these in particular because of their containment was one element of consideration in terms of their eventual allocation, but also recognising that there's the ability to expand the village in terms of additional growth in this location. Equally, obviously, we'll come on to with Kelvedon and Hatch as well. Those two sites equally were, from the site assessment process, considered to be appropriate. So, in terms of our overall position, we've tried to identify as best possible all the suitable sites in village locations where that's appropriate. And then these are, in terms of the northern villages, these are the locations that have been identified to sort of meet that requirement. But I would obviously emphasise that we're trying to look at limited growth. We're not talking about significant expansion of those locations. So very much trying to keep it to a scale commensurate to the locations they're being expanded on.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Quilter. Can I move on to understanding the capacity that's set out in the submitted plan in relation to the numbers of houses that are proposed within the two sites? Again, can the council just explain the justification for those, the amounts of houses that are proposed, please?
Thank you, Inspector. I think, as Mr. Quilter set out, the process by which we've gone through thinking about all sites has taken on the kind of relevant density and character of the surrounding area, and thinking about that when setting out the approximate numbers within policies that we would expect to be delivered, alongside working with those promoting particular sites whereby we've got information that would aid the sort of layouts and densities that are potentially possible. In terms of the addendum of focus changes, are you meaning to come on to that in terms of the reduced?
Well, I'd like to understand the evidence for why the sites are, well, if you can just summarise the densities for those two sites first for me, and then just explain the reasonings behind the focus changes and the submission, where obviously the numbers were reduced from the pre-submission level, and the evidence that backs up that reasoning, just so that I can understand where that's come from and whether the numbers are justified in terms of the capacity.
Yeah, thank you, Inspector. So yes, the densities obviously are low for these sites in terms of what the numbers that are being brought forward as proposed in the addendum of focus changes. So we are talking sort of sub 15 dwellings per hectare as a result of those numbers that are associated with that site. But I think equally we're recognising the in terms of the council decision to make that, obviously recognising the local feeling of compatibility of development in their location, obviously the representative of a village in its rural nature. That's the part of the reasoning behind that, really, in terms of how the council has made a decision in terms of the numbers that should be set out in policy for the proposals in this location.
So are there any particular site constraints in terms of highways or flooding or biodiversity or anything like that as to why it's purely down to character? Is that what you're saying, as to why these sites are set at the capacity that is set within the submitted plan? Just so I can understand whether there are any other particular reasons or site constraints.
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Inspector. So in terms of site R26, there was some consideration of the surface water flooding issues in the locality. Sorry, in terms of that further consideration, and in terms of any other broad impacts, I think that they're considered to be acceptable from that position. There were some comments back from the County Council in respect of R26 again, but in terms of their view now that the access onto Red Rose Lane, for example, would be more compatible at that lower number. And I think it's, from that position, I think we sort of feel that that's applicable regarding the sort of consideration of the densities in those locations. But there's nothing further in terms of that.
Notwithstanding that, and I made this point yesterday at the end of one of the morning session yesterday morning. Obviously, the wording within the policy is around because the council sees it being more appropriate to determine the actual numbers of dwellings or units that will come forward as part of a planning application process. Do you also see that in this case for these two sites, because the wording is still around in those locations? Is that still the case?
Yes, thank you, Inspector. I think we wanted to try and maintain a consistent approach across the site allocation policies to I suppose reflect the fact that whenever a planning application comes along, there will be more information that will inform better the level of development that can come forward on the site according to the evidence at that point. And so we've tried to avoid, I suppose, an absolute limit or indeed upper number that may well be less. I think, as you referred to yesterday, we're probably expecting in most cases that sites would be more than that number if they're going to be different from that number rather than less, but there is the opportunity for less development to come forward. So I think what we're trying to do is reflect a number that feels right according to the character of the area and the constraints that we've discussed. And therefore maintain that around term in this policy as well as the others. I think that issue around highways access, that would be where the Highways Authority, as have been discussing with us, would then be able to be in receipt of more information for a planning application that would inform whether or not the details of any access and design is appropriate according to the level of development that is there. But at this point, in terms of the local plan work that we've done, we've identified that can be accommodated as Mr. Quarter sets out in terms of working through the Highways Authority with those issues. I think broadly, just to reflect on the fact that as you'll be aware from the addendum of focus changes, the detail within that document, the decision that the council took to undertake that further consultation before submitting the plan, that was really in response to trying to understand and consider the level of objection and feeling that there was in particular local communities, one of which clearly Blackmore, as we're discussing today, the other we will discuss, I think, on Friday, whereby we were looking to, I suppose, relook at the justification for the allocation in the first place, which we'll come on to in terms of the defensible boundaries and the reason why we consider that to be appropriate as we've gone into for Greenbelt perspective, but also reflect something of the concern about overdevelopment and trying to reduce wherever possible the levels of development that would then be more consistent with the character of the local village. So that is the main thrust behind the types of numbers that are in there, albeit we do maintain that term around means that the planning application could come forward to suggest something that may be more than that. But I think what that general change in number reflects is the fact that a lower density, a lower number overall, therefore providing less impact locally, is certainly something that this council wants to try and achieve on the basis of local concern about impact.
And what is the local concern about impact? What evidence is there on that?
So the council considered representations of multiple residents who wrote in at both of those local plan stages of both Reg 19 consultations. I'm sure Mr. Whipps will elaborate more on specifically the parish council and the BVHA position, but predominantly it was around the impact when it came to levels of, well, I think fundamentally the things that we felt we could accommodate in terms of those objections were around character. We understand that the objections themselves were on things like traffic impact, impact on local services and facilities, flood risk in particular that we've covered and no doubt we'll talk more on. Those sort of the high level fundamental concerns that local residents had. I think when we looked at the transport assessment work and the level of impact that traffic would have, that in itself was not something that we felt was wholly massively different from the upper levels compared to the levels that we brought them down to. And certainly in terms of impact on local facilities, I think what the council has always been keen to do is to not be flippant about the fact that we're talking about relatively lower numbers in comparison to some other areas and some other sites, because we do understand the concern that there is locally about that number on the village population, and therefore, whether or not that's a low number compared to the wider strategic piece, we want to try and maintain and understand and consider that concern that there is locally. So we've really come back to that point around character, considering the low density of the village, the fact that the village is in sort of the northernmost part of the borough, and I know that is certainly one of the things that there were concerns about, was the consistency and relevance to the overall strategy, where we've thereby tried to locate growth in the growth corridors, as we've discussed, the wider strategy piece, but at the same time being aware of the extent to which we want to try and spread growth where it's appropriate. And again, we'll come on to the appropriateness of the sites and what we've suggested with defensible boundaries and what can be achieved here in Blackmore. But trying to balance as much as possible the need to grow in villages where it is appropriate and possible to do so, but at the same time balancing that overall number of new homes so that the impacts are not perceived locally to be so considerable.
And just before we move off this sort of, well, I know I've got several hands up, so before I go to those participants, have you assessed the density of the locality in relation to the village, and does the sub 15 dwellings per hectare, whatever the actual figure is, does that reflect, as in what is the density for the actual village itself, or areas of the village that are adjacent to these sites in terms of character?
Thank you, Inspector. We have looked at villages across the borough in terms of the broad density levels. I'd need to just find that in terms of what the actual figures are for Blackmore, but I know that we did a piece of work to consider that broadly, and we think the lower density numbers are consistent with that. And coming back to the settlement hierarchy, I suppose, as well, which we may well come on to in terms of the other comments that have been made in regard to Blackmore and the way that fits into it, we think is appropriate, the numbers that are being brought forward and the numbers that are currently there.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Drain. If you can provide those figures, that would be very useful. Or that figure. That would be.
We may be able to do that now and provide it in this session, but
if not, as soon as you can, that'd just be useful. Thank you very much. I will come to the participants, and I'm just going to go down in order. I know that Mr. Whips, you did put up your hand first, and then I will come to Mr. Thomas and then Mr. Turney. So, Mr. Whips, please.
Well, firstly, may I say, with all due respect to Mr. Turney, I think he actually put his hand up first.
Oh, my apologies. I must have missed it.
No, I don't want to do Mr. Turney out of batting first, but equally I'm happy to proceed. And as my clients object in principle to this development or this allocation, it may be better if I make my cases sooner, make my points now, so that Mr. Turney may well want to comment on them.
I'm very happy with that. Thank you, Mr. Whips.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Turney. Mr. Whips, please.
Mom, as you'll be aware from our hearing statements, the Parish Council and those that I represent have an in principle objection to this, and we say that there cannot possibly be exceptional circumstances, and in particular, where we say things have gone wrong, if I may put it that, is, as I said yesterday, is in the application of the strategy or applying the strategy in practice. And I think it's appropriate to take a step back when looking at Blackmore and just assess just exactly what is Blackmore. Blackmore is a village in a rural setting. It's relatively remote, unlike some of the other villages which are very close to Brentwood and other larger settlements within the district. And it borders Chelmsford and Epping Forest, where again it's very rural in nature. As a consequence, this is a settlement where there's a very high car dependency. The availability of services are modest, as we set out, and they're significantly less than Kelvedon Hatch or Doddinghurst, which again have populations which are approximately double those of Blackmore. And whilst we will make our submissions in writing in due course, for the purpose of this afternoon, I say, as we say in our evidence, we don't accept that Blackmore is correctly categorised as a settlement in Category 3, and we've had regard to document F59, and so long as I've interpreted the map at the back of that correctly, it's interesting that the ONS now distinguish between Blackmore and Kelvedon Hatch and Doddinghurst, and Kelvedon Hatch and Doddinghurst are seen as rural towns on the fringe of other settlements. But the council themselves describe Category 3 as rural settings that provide the day-to-day needs in small local centres. Blackmore just simply doesn't have that local centre. The other thing I think to put in mind when we look at this is that this is not insignificant development in Blackmore. There's some 450 dwellings in Blackmore now. If we increase it by 50 or more, that's in the order of 10%. I also think it's worth looking at the way the council have allocated within the larger villages. Of the larger villages, the council just acknowledged, and the reference here is to the topic paper on the spatial strategy, paragraph 7.1. Only there were 34 sites which came through from the HELA, and 4 were allocated, two of them being sites. And we say the council have certainly not justified that, and in particular it's illogical what the council have done, we say, because there are other sites, and we've shown as examples R18 and R19 in Shenfield, which we say are more appropriate in terms of the strategy and are able to produce larger numbers of properties. Alternatively, there are better sites in Kelvedon Hatch. So in terms of are there exceptional circumstances, obviously the housing need is not of itself sufficient. This site does serve Greenbelt purposes moderately well, and when we say you take into account all the other matters, the nature of the settlement, and I won't go into detail, but the flooding, highways and infrastructure, particularly in relation to education, we say that exceptional circumstances can't possibly exist, and therefore we say there's an in principle objection to this development.
Mr. Whips, if I can just ask you a question, based on just on what you've said in relation to. I am looking at the settlement at F59.
Yep.
This settlement hierarchy, because I to just look at that. You said there isn't a local centre, but the council has put in that there is. Can you just explain to me? And I have been to the village.
Well, we say that.
Can you just explain to me from your perspective why you consider there isn't a local centre?
Yeah, the services are modest. It's limited to a co-op, a coffee shop, hairdressers, and the primary school, and that is it. Whereas by comparison, if one looks at Kelvedon Hatch or Doddinghurst, they have significantly more, and we set out the facilities there in our hearing statement.
Thank you, Mr. Whips. I'm sure I'll come back to you on other points, but I'll bring in some other participants first.
Yes, ma'am. What I've sought to do there is really deal with your first question, really, the exceptional.
That's right. We'll move on to the other questions. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Whips. Can I then bring in? I will come to. I did say I'd come to Mr. Thomas first. So, Mr. Turney, are you okay with that? Because I realise that you've been sitting there for a while with your hand up.
No, that's fine, Madam. I'm happy for Mr. Thomas to go before me if he'd like to. Either way.
Mr. Thomas, then please, and then I'll go to Mr. Turney.
I mean, thank you, Mum. I mean, from our perspective, I think we just like to say that we fully support the allocation, certainly of site 26, which I'm representing today. I think from our view, I think we appreciate what you said about site capacity and kind of not being definitive. But there is the reduction in the units that number of units that we just like to explore with the council. I mean, from what the council have said, I think our understanding is that, I think the key reason, technical reason, is due to flooding and surface water flooding. Specifically in relation to that, our client has done their own detailed technical work in relation to flood risk. We have undertaken our own hydraulic modelling in relation to the river adjacent. This has been submitted to the EA, and who've confirmed that the site is located in flood zone 1. In terms of the surface water drainage issue, then appreciate on the flood zone maps there is a part of the site that falls within an area of high risk. However, that's approximately 10% of the site. As part of the plan application process, there will be a detailed flood risk assessment undertaken that deal with any issues to do with surface water drainage, and there will be mitigation within the site. And so what that will do will improve the surface water drainage issues, I think, on the site, but also in the adjoining area as well. So we're confident at plan applicant stage that issue would be resolved. So I suppose the point we'd like to make is, from a technical perspective, we don't think there's a strong justification for the reduction in terms of the number of units on site in terms of the allocation.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. If I can turn to Mr. Turney, please.
Thank you, Madam. Can I just pick up 3 points, please? First of all is the consideration of the application of the spatial strategy, the hierarchy, settlement hierarchy specifically. The second one is exceptional circumstances, and the third is the reduction from 40 to 30 for site R25. Just dealing first of all with the suitability of Blackmore as a location for growth. You've identified, Madam, that there is a local centre which is identified in the council's published documents. There's a primary school, co-op shop and pubs. So we say this is a location which has got a good number of local facilities, and therefore it's a sustainable location for growth, applying the settlement hierarchy that the council has put forward. So that's the first point. The second point on exceptional circumstances, obviously there's the borough-wide exceptional circumstances case, which is not for today and don't need to repeat. In terms of this site at R25, it's a site which is ranked as making a moderate contribution, and sites that make a lesser contribution are all to be allocated in the plan process, so it is not an outlier in that regard. There's no material incursion into the countryside. There's a strong defensible boundary along the road, and that makes it an appropriate location for rounding off the settlement of Blackmore with a new defensible greenbelt boundary. The points that the council made in response to your questions on the reduction from 40 to 30 were essentially justified on the basis of character. And I just asked you to note, please, that when you asked what were the factors, the development control factors that might justify the reduction. Mr. Quilter couldn't identify any such factors for R25. He mentioned a couple in respect of R26, but he couldn't suggest any for R25. The reality is that the council have done what they said at paragraph 21 of their hearing statement they shouldn't do, which is to be persuaded by local representation alone. Whilst obviously the views of the local community are hugely important, and my client's been trying to take these into account in promoting this site, we do say that this site clearly has capacity for at least 40 dwellings. That's what we propose, 40 dwellings. There is no constraint on the delivery of 40 dwellings. We have assessed that in terms of heritage, flood, ecology, archaeology, and so on, highways. That's all set out in our hearing statement at 2.14 onwards, so I don't repeat that. But all of those constraints have been addressed, and it's been shown that this site can come forward for 40 dwellings. In terms of density and character, we've produced an indicative layout, which is at Appendix 1 to our hearing statement, and you would have seen that. I don't need to go to it now. But it's clear from that that the density which is proposed of the built part of R25 would correspond to the character of the village and would be an appropriate density in urban design terms. But also R25 will accommodate a very substantial area of unbuilt land, green space by way of a village green, and therefore respond yet further to the rural the rural aspects of the village character. So in those circumstances, there really is no justification for reducing the allocation from 40 to 30, and what that does then is really show a failure to make best use of the land once it has been allocated. So for those reasons, whilst we recognise the council is trying to accommodate the concerns of local residents, in reality those concerns are not going to be sensibly accommodated by simply reducing the quantum of development on the site. 40 produces an appropriate density and should be reflected in the plan. So those are the points on those three topics that I wanted to address.
Thank you, Mr. Turney. Mr. Whipps, is this on the same point? Because I do want a response from the council. Or are these new points?
Mark, I wanted to respond to Mr. Thomas on flooding at some stage. That's why I put my hand up.
Now's appropriate then, please.
Yes, I wasn't sure. Mum, you'll be aware that my clients have considerable concerns in respect of flooding, particularly in relation to R26. And I say that's perfectly justified and more should have been done by now. The Surface Water Management Plan, January 2015, acknowledged that Blackmore had problems with water courses and recommended that outside of the Surface Water Management Plan, it was necessary to construct fluvial hydraulic model to map flood risk. The HELA acknowledged there was a high risk of flooding. The Strategic Flood Risk Assessment did exactly the same in acknowledging that hydraulic assessment of unmodelled main rivers was necessary. And Mum, I just ask you to look in due course at the figures which are in Appendix A of the Strategic Flood Risk Assessment document C16, because what you see there in very short is that there's no Environment Agency modelling north of Blackmore. It stops on the southern part of the village. That's figure A3B. You then see on figure A4B the surface water flood risk, and you'll see that it is to a large scale, but it would seem to actually touch and concern R26. But certainly when you take into account climate change, which is on figure A6B, you'll see that a significant part of R26 is an area potentially vulnerable to climate change. And what I simply say on this is relying upon what the National Planning Practice Guidance says, is that the strategic flood risk assessment should identify the type of measures which may be appropriate. And what I say is that it's been flagged up over a number of years, and whether the flooding issues can be resolved because they exist now is a matter which shouldn't be left to the planning application stage, but should be dealt with at this stage, because one can't see, one's unaware as to whether this site is actually achievable or deliverable. And the final point is, there's clear evidence from what we put forward that the flood risking does become a more frequent occurrence.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Whips. Can I come, Mr. Thomas, is this in response to some of these points, and then I'll come to the council. Mr. Thomas, then, please. Yeah,
just a response to that. The hydraulic modelling assessment that was referred to by Mr. Whips has been undertaken by my client. That has been submitted to the Environment Agency, and they've confirmed that the site is in flood zone 1 and are happy with what has been done there. We can provide that information to you if that would be helpful as part of the examination to deal with that point.
I think that would be very useful to actually have, and or if it's not necessarily the evidence, it's a note, either from yourselves or in conjunction with the council, so that we can understand what evidence is there in relation, because I've got obviously the evidence that Mr. Whips is putting forward in relation to his clients. It would be useful to have a note to understand what work has been done and what that work is concluding and what's coming out. Okay. How big is I'm just loath. We've got so many documents. It can certainly provide it. Is it a large document?
It's a fairly chunky.
They usually are. That's not, these hydraulic ones. So I'm more than happy for them to be provided, because then it gives everybody the opportunity to look at the raw data. But I think what's more important is actually the drawing out of what the conclusions are, or any recommendations or any mitigation measures or anything like that, so that we have a real understanding of that.
We could do a summary of it as well and send that.
That would be really useful. But provide the raw data, because then people can have a look at that. And yeah, okay. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for that. Mr. Whips, you've still got your hand up. Is that new or? Right, lovely. Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Anything further that you wanted to say, because you've got your hand up? No, that's it for now. Okay. Council, do you want to respond back on anything that you've heard? Obviously, you're hearing from two of the site promoters, the site developers, and then obviously with what Mr. Whips has said in relation to his clients. So anything you would like to respond back on, please?
Thank you, Inspector. I think we understand the points that have been made by the site promoters around density and their view of the higher original figures being appropriate. We understand that perspective, but as I've set out, the council's view is that the numbers on the site have been reduced in order to limit the impacts that are concerning local residents in that area, on the grounds of trying to be consistent with character. Just been trying to crunch some numbers on the density issue in terms of what we discussed earlier. I think I'd not realised, but we have set out the density of the sites to you in the hearing statement, in case that was a question. So that's in paragraph 19 of our hearing statement. I think your question was more around the density of the existing village. It's
the locality, really, because you're saying it's in it follows the character. That's why you've reduced the density. But I'd like to understand. I can see obviously off mapping, and I've been there myself. Yeah. So I can understand the density, but I would just like a figure, if at all possible.
Yeah, so I think within our assessment hierarchy, we've tried to break that down, but I'm conscious that within that line, it looks to me as though it's population of the areas are then broken down by hectare rather than necessarily dwellings. So that might be something that we just go away. It probably wouldn't take very long, but just crunch some numbers on to have that understanding. I suspect within that context, as you've just said, you know the area and the extent to which the surrounding residential properties, I think, are predominantly of a 1970s, very roughly 1980s style development there, and reasonably dense. So this would be probably a lessening, a reduced density towards the edge of the village that we would think would be appropriate, but it may well be that we can just look at those density figures to confirm that. In terms of local centre, I think, you know, we've looked at that. Our position is it is a local centre. It has those facilities. We very much appreciate that those facilities are limited, as in many rural areas. So there's no debate there. But the reality is that those local facilities are there, and therefore we think it is fair to distinguish that as a local character. And we will certainly set out that position as we have done through the settlement hierarchy work that we've done, that I know that will no doubt come on to further discussion. And then on flooding, essentially, we've looked at all sites with Essex County Council as the lead local flood authority with regard to surface water flooding in particular, and considered this issue as we set out in terms of trying to think about R26 in particular. Essex County Council are satisfied as lead local flood authority that development here is acceptable, subject to the mitigation that we've set out within the policy, which we consider to be appropriate in that sense. It's worth saying, I know that the residents in Blackmore have raised issues around the appropriateness of development, but then also suggested that brownfield locations are more appropriate. And we had a debate about the brownfield location to the north of Red Rose Lane, which has in the past gained planning permission and I think recently been completed. That is in the same area that we're talking about here in terms of those flooding issues that occur.
I did see that under construction when I visited, yes.
Yes, and I know that in particular the BVHA and residents have raised that as an example of where development, in their view, I think would be more appropriate compared to a greenfield location. That's not necessarily the point I'm making here, but the point is that the development has been built out, it's got permission, it's, as you said, it's being it's nearly completed, it is there, it is considered to not be fundamentally restricted by flood issues in the sense that it has come forward in that way. So I think that gives a picture of how development and certainly what we're looking at here with policy would be able to mitigate those issues.
Thank you. Still staying on the issue of the site capacity, how has or has the council reassessed that in terms of viability? Or maybe the land promoters can assist me with that in relation to the numbers that are now set in the submitted plan rather than in the pre-submission plan, to the reduced numbers.
Just quickly on that, Inspector. So yes, the viability assessment and the way that that's been carried out obviously allows for potential changes in numbers on sites, and the outcomes of this would still fall within the thresholds based on the required mitigation. So in our view, the council's view, the sites would still be considered viable in conformity with policy.
Thank you. It's certainly not anything that's been raised in any of the hearing statements or in any of the statements of common ground, but obviously I have the land promoters here today, so it's always worth hearing from the horse's mouth, per se. So I'm sorry, I don't know who put their hand up first, because it does it in Zoom, it puts it in order, but not in Teams. So I'm going to go from the top of the list. So it's Mr. Turney this time. You get to go first.
Thank you very much. I didn't know if I beat Mr. Thomas, but just to say that from the perspective of R25, that there is no viability argument raised against the reduction per se. We propose to deliver policy compliant levels of affordable housing. So rather than it being a viability point, it's simply that there'll be fewer affordable housing units. The site can still be delivered, but it will be delivered in a way which delivers fewer benefits in terms of both market and affordable housing. I hope that helps. I should also say that the proposal, which for our site is at a fairly advanced stage and would be the subject of a detailed planning application shortly after allocation, is for 40 dwellings. And obviously the detail would have to be revisited for a 30 dwelling scheme. So we don't suggest there's a viability impediment to the plan in terms, but obviously those matters would have to be revisited as a matter of detailed design if we had to go back to the drawing board and decide where to lose 10 dwellings from the scheme which we've worked up and assessed and are ready to apply for.
Thank you, Mr. Turney. I will come back in relation to the sort of the deliverability and the planning process, etc. So I will come back on that point. Oh, the other hand has gone down. Oh no, Mr. Thomas, please.
Thank you. I mean, I think Mr. Turney probably explained what I was going to say, that you know, there aren't any viability issues surrounding the reduction in the quantum of units. However, you know, it does result in the reduction of affordable housing, which, you know, I think is a key component for how. So
it's the same point from your perspective for your client site. Okay. Yes. So can I move on to just understand the where the sites are at in terms of the planning process, whether if the council can start on that point, and then if the promoters wish to add anything, that'd be really useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Inspector. So in respect of site R25, there have been some pre-app discussions that have taken place at early stages in terms of looking at the site and what that could bring forward. Obviously, I would expect that those discussions internally with the site promoters have been ongoing in terms of working through those schemes, as has been alluded to. And in terms of the other site R26, I don't believe there's been any pre-app discussions, but obviously Mr. Thomas may be able to elaborate further. Obviously, there has been work undertaken, as you mentioned, in terms of the flood risk assessment or flood works that have been looked at in terms of evidence. So certainly the schemes are being worked up as we understand them and ready for submission.
Thank you. Do either of the promoters wish to add anything? Mr. Turney, please.
Thank you, Madam. In respect of R25, matters are at a fairly advanced stage. As has just been explained, there has been a pre-app. Essentially, as I hinted at, the planning application would be made as soon as the plan is in place. As you'll see from our hearing statement, almost all of the technical work for this site has been done in the sense of analysis of ecology, flood risk, highways, heritage, archaeology, and so on. And that's been done by a consultant team who will be instructed to deliver the site on the ground. It will be a detailed application. The pre-application was based on the indicative layout, which you've seen in our hearing statement. And my client is not a land promoter. It builds out its sites. So it is in essence ready to go with an application on allocation, and it's for that reason that the statement of common ground between us and the council recognises that we can deliver on our 40 figure 20 units in 22-23 and a further 20 in 23-24. So it's in a relatively short time frame from now that those completions will be delivered.
Thank you. Mr. Whipps, if you just bear with me, I'm going to go to Mr. Thomas first so that he can respond on the other site, and then I'll come to you, Mr. Whipps, if that's okay. Anything to add then, Mr. Thomas? Yes, so from our perspective, essentially we've been waiting for the plan to be adopted, and once that's the case, we're in a position when we're ready to go. Like I've said, we've done hydraulic modelling work, we've done a number of other technical studies to support the development of the site. We have provided an indicative layout as part of the representations. But from our perspective, we're ready to go. We, have a house builder that is ready to deliver this site. So there's nothing holding us back, really.
So we'll just have to go through the normal pre-application and submission process following examination.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Mr. Whipps, please.
Thank you, Ma'am. I hope this is the right time to raise this point, but in respect of R25, thank you, Mr. Turney, for giving us your current position. I have some concerns with regard to the access. The original plan proposed access onto Red Rose Lane, which my clients objected to, and I note that within the County Council statement, they shared that concern and they proposed via a main modification to have access from 9 Ashes Road. That's a main modification to which the public probably are not aware, but they will have at that state, at the main modifications consultation period, they'll have a chance to comment. I just wanted to draw to your attention that 9 Ashes Road is the same road which serves the primary school, and the Parish Council's initial thoughts are that they're concerned as to whether the 9 Ashes Road is appropriate given the position of the primary school. But as it's a main modification, we haven't seen any justification for that yet. In respect of R26, again, in respect of access, the County Council again, sorry, if I could just go back one stage, and again, in the main modification, it's left open that the access could be, for R25, the access could be via Red Rose Lane or 9 Ashes Road, but that's inconsistent with what the County Council say in their hearing statement, where they say it's now understood that a scheme can be achieved on a site which provides access from 9 Ashes Road only, and that they've agreed to make an amendment. So the Parish Council are concerned that there appears to be some inconsistency there. In respect of R26, again, the County Council did express concern about Red Rose Lane, and they subsequently said, in view of the reduced numbers, they could live with it. But they have also, but the policy talks about having access from Orchard Peace or from Fingriff Hall Road. Again, my clients, that's a main modification. My clients haven't seen any justification for that. And they also have concerns about traffic on those roads. That's all I'd need to say on that point, Ma'am.
Thank you. In relation to, that's quite a good point to come to the issues that are raised within the suggested changes that are set out by the council. Now, these aren't necessarily, all these changes aren't necessarily something that we would push for, we would recommend to go forward. So it's understanding those changes. So in relation, if we can just pick up the points that Mr. Whipps has raised, in relation to access, can the council just go through why the change? I know why the changes have been set out because I understand the County Council's concerns that were raised, and that they are in response to that, and the County Council is quite happy with those suggested changes. Can the council just run through it for both of the sites that are set out in the for both of the policies that are set out in F9A, please? Because you're now proposing your different wording, so it's under 1B.
So it's R25.
R25 first, and then R26.
Yep. Okay. So I'm just comparing the two. I think, yeah, so in terms of the suggested modifications in F9A for policy R25, we're talking about obviously trying to reflect the County Council's comments in respect of the fact that they're saying that it may not be able to, obviously Red Rose Lane may not be appropriate, and I think it's a case of recommending that the 9 Ashes Road could be more appropriate from, it could be more appropriate from 9 Ashes Road. So I think we've obviously provided that that flexibility in terms of obviously subject to an application coming in terms of that assessment being carried out. I think also this is taking it back a step, obviously, in terms of the council's position from the point of view of the transport assessment. There are no issues raised in respect of the very specific matters like this. Obviously, we are reliant upon the Highway Authority to raise these specific access points, and that's where those points have come from. In respect of R26, where we're talking about proposed recommendation of changes to say provide vehicular access by Red Rose Lane, Orchard Piece or Fingering Fall Lane. Again, it's trying to follow the wording of the what the County Council has set out in terms of there's obviously not saying it has to be from that location, but it could be more appropriate from those locations. So I think it's obviously just trying to reflect the possibility of those other places that could achieve access.
So it's in response to the County Council representations that have been made.
Yeah, we're trying to reflect what the County Council
and allows an element of flexibility when it comes to any planning application. Should these applications go through? Should these allocations remain? Yes. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Turney, please.
Thank you, Madam. Can I just address you briefly on site access for R25? The position is that in our Regulation 19 submission, we explained why a site access could be delivered from Red Rose Lane. That was the subject of objection from Mr. Whips's clients, who preferred the idea of an access on 9 Ashes Road. So we went back and looked at that, and that is now the subject of consideration in Appendix 2 to our hearing statement, where we have done a full design for that means of access. We know that the County Council is content with that. That has been the subject of a pre-application discussion with the County Council and indeed with the borough. So we know that they're content. The position, as has been noted, is there's a slight inconsistency between the proposed change, which has the alternatives, and the position that's agreed between the Borough Council and the County Council. I've got that in the Statement of Common Ground between the County Council and the Borough Council, F17D, and at page 63 of that document, where I think the agreed position as of November last year was that the reference to Red Rose Lane should be deleted for this site. We, as the landowner and the promoter of the site, are in a position where we say, well, we've shown that both can work. We are content and have given an indicative design based on 9 Ashes Road being the preferred access. That is the preferred access for the County Council. It's agreed by the Borough Council, and it's the preferred access for Mr. Whips's clients, the local residents. So certainly we are content with the further amendment that removes the Red Rose Lane alternative. And we haven't identified any road safety issue that I think Mr. Whips was alluding to, nor have the County Council. Thank you.
Thank you for that update. Right, can I move on and ask, Mr. Thomas, please.
Thank you, Matt. I was just going to say that in terms of the amended policy, notwithstanding our concerns about the reduction in capacity, we're supportive of the amended wording.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Can I now look at some of the specific wording of or some other specific wording in the policies? If I can look at R25 first. There's a requirement in there for this minimum provision of 25% of the dwellings to be reserved for people with a strong and demonstrable local connection, and or those over 50 years of age. Can the council just explain that requirement being in that policy and how that approach is justified, please?
Thank you, Inspector. So in terms of the origin of that was from when we was agreeing the plan, so the council come to a decision to they felt that it was appropriate for the village, or these allocations within the village, to accommodate, again reflecting local concerns about the ability of local people to access new homes in this location. So the council decision to bring in or stipulate that requirements should be added in. Obviously, this is prior to the plan being submitted, so obviously not before you in that respect, but the actual the final submitted plan resulted in this additional wording that we put into the policy. So it is trying to reflect the local situation in terms of what the sense of feeling is in terms of what was access to homes and the affordability of those. And obviously that's something that we try to reflect in the policies for both R25 and R26. And I think obviously the criteria that I think we've obviously proposed to amend in F9A, let's turn to that. So, yeah, so I think we've proposed to amend that under MM112 for R25 in terms of, yeah, so there is some further refinement, I think, in terms of what we've set out in those policies, but there's still the same aim, in effect, to try and provide for that local need, and obviously the demonstration of that in terms of marketing for the site.
And based on, I suppose I want to understand what the evidence is, what that requirement is based on. What's the actual piece of evidence that I can refer to say that absolutely there is a huge issue for people over 50 or for local people obtaining a house in this locality? So can you point me to that evidence, please?
Obviously, in terms of what we set out within the hearing statement,
because I suppose I'm just struggling to understand why it's so specific for this location. Of course, it's a village location, and if there is evidence setting out that people are struggling within that locality to buy a house or rent a house or get affordable housing or whatever, but I have a particular issue with all those over 50 years of age when you have a primary school in the locality. So why would the council wish to push for a large proportion? I mean, 25%, that's a quarter of the houses on the site. That's not an insubstantial number. Would be for those potentially those over 50. And I'm just trying to understand the council's reasoning and their approach to why that is a requirement in this location. I'm not saying that it can't be that way, but I'm just trying to understand the council's approach.
Certainly, yeah. I mean, I think broadly speaking, obviously, in terms of the SHMA part 2, where we're talking about specific needs of groups, obviously we're looking at that in I appreciate that's in broad terms, where we're looking at there is obviously an affordability issue in the borough, and I do appreciate that as a whole, and that can be more acute in terms of village locations where the choice of dwellings is much more restricted. So I think it was not necessarily specifically referring to this particular location, but by no means is it necessarily not an issue in this area, which has been reflected in the representations that we've received from local residents in some instances. So I think it very broadly we're referring to the SHMA Part 2 in terms of the sort of the general needs of the area, and also recognising that accommodation for older people, I suppose it may not. Yeah, for older people, obviously, is also an identified need. Obviously, like I say, much more in a broader sense that the Schmal Part 2 refers to them.
So in this sense, sorry, I'm trying not to labour the point, but I'm still a bit confused as to why this is a requirement for these two sites. So it's not, you're not requiring specialist elderly accommodation, or is that what you're referring? Because that would be over 55 in relation to the new to the definition, or are you actually heading towards that route of this would be specialist elderly accommodation? I'm not getting that from the information that I've read. Yeah. I'm just trying to understand why. Particularly the wording of those over 50 years of age. I don't understand that element and why that would come in and why that would be justified.
Yeah, I think in terms of what on reflection, I think in terms of it may well be better to distinguish between, obviously we've got this general local need that's identified, or requirement, sorry, for them to be made available to people with strong local connection. In terms of distinguishing that between, that and the people of over 55, for example, that may be more appropriate. But yeah, I think we can consider that further in terms of just trying to make that more appropriate for that side of it. Obviously, we're trying to reflect local concerns. I think it's probably where that's led from, and trying to make it more acceptable in local circumstance.
But again, are you telling me there is no evidence in relation to whether people can access housing in this location as to why 25% would need to be reserved for people with that strong local connection?
Yeah, I mean, the main evidence we're relying upon, as I say, is the Schmal Part 2, and that only goes so far, but that's obviously what we could refer to in terms of what we've got before us.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Thomas, please.
Thank you. Just in relation to this particular policy, in our hearing statement, we don't object to it. And if there's evidence, there is demand for it, then we want to provide a diverse and appropriate mix of housing. However, I think there is just a slight concern, I guess, if there is a requirement yet. If there aren't purchasers coming forward to take these properties, what happens to them? And I think there should be some kind of flexibility or wording, whether that's at this stage in the policy. Usually it might come in as in the Section 106 agreement that's attached to a development, just in terms of how what happens after a certain amount of time if no one comes forward during the marketing for these units, and there should be allowance that it could revert back to normal housing or traditional market sale. So I think that's something that it'd be worth looking at.
I've certainly read that in your hearing statement, and it's something that obviously I want to see what the council says in response to that. I also would like to understand from the council's perspective how this part of the policy would be implemented. Is it through a Section 106, or would it be through some other means as to how? And obviously, is this in perpetuity, like it would be for affordable housing, etc.? And how would that be done? Would that again be through some form of Section 106 agreement?
Ma'am, if I may assist here, and I'm not addressing the issue of evidence for this, just a bit merely the way in which it will be operated. There's nothing in the policy to suggest that it should be in perpetuity. I think the requirement is the initial requirement, that the reservation should be for those people, and it would be achieved via a Section 106 obligation. There's no other way to do it. Because it would need also to contain criteria to determine how long they need to be reserved for.
Okay.
And what happens if that period is exceeded, then what happens, etc. So in terms of mechanics, I think that's how it would work. without addressing the evidential issues, which of course you're concerned to deal with. So I leave it at that for the moment.
Thank you, Mr. Shadarevian. Mr. Warden.
Thank you, Mrs. Wright. I think actually the question I was going to ask has actually just been asked by yourself, but just in relation to the policy that is subject to document F9A, the main modification. So that's a suggested modification by the council in terms of that wording. The reference to affordable housing has been taken out, but that's because that's been done across the board, presumably. So the it now says that provide a minimum of 25% of the proposed dwellings to be reserved for people with strong and demonstrable local connection or those over 50. Is that in addition to affordable housing, or does that policy requirement apply across the board so it could include some of the affordable housing?
Our view is it could include affordable housing. So I think it's a 25% on the total quantum of the site, and obviously that could apply to different tenures. Yeah.
And those over 50, so they're from anywhere. They're not subject to any spatial test. They could be from anywhere.
So I mean, I think the point being is that it could form part of the affordable housing requirement for the site. So I think it's obviously able to form affordable housing. I think that's the key point.
Do you think the policy is clear?
The policy isn't clear. I'll be perfectly candid. The policy is not clear, and it needs us to look at it. In fact, it's beginning to embarrass me a little, because I think we need to consider this very carefully, both this policy R25 and R26, and come back to you on these two policies. I really do think it's important to do so. I think you've interrogated this and highlighted some shortcomings, serious shortcomings with these policies, which I have no doubt at all can be made effective and cured. But I think we need, rather than to deal with it on the hoof, after this discussion, I think we need time to go back and consider it.
Thank you.
No, I appreciate that. Mr. Warden.
I'm being candid.
Thank you. I do appreciate your candidness, because I was about to become a bit more candid myself, to be fair. So you've probably sort of reached that point first. I like people to have a right to have their say first. Mr. Warden, anything further that you want?
No, Mr. Shadarevian's
point just continue,
because
we are sort of starting to come to the end of R25, R26. We're not quite there yet. I suppose my question would be, and I know Mr. Shadarevian has stated that you're going to have a look at these policies, is would it cause concern for elements of these policies, the criteria, such as this criteria about the minimum number, the 25% for local people? If there's no evidence, then it's not justified. And this element about 50 years of age, etc. Again, if there's no evidence, and you're not telling me that you have any evidence on that, but please provide it if you do have it. Would that cause any concerns to the council in relation to if that was taken out of the policy?
Ma'am, the fact is that this is, if you like, a requirement which is justified by local circumstances, which needs to be evidenced. It doesn't go to the principle of development. It can't do, because we're assessing the site for its capacity and its appropriateness for development purposes, and to contribute to the strategy of the plan in terms of the need it needs to satisfy. So I don't think it would have an impact in principle on the allocation, simply the way in which the proposed dwellings are to be allocated.
Thank you. I'll bring Mr. Turney in now, please.
Thank you, Madam. I was just really going to anticipate, well, I was anticipating, and now I can just echo what Mr. Shadaravian has kindly said, which is that these points about the detail of the housing allocation policy can't possibly cut to the principle of the soundness of the allocation. Whether they're justified as additional requirements, obviously the council is going to look at that again, and I won't prejudge their consideration of it. But it can't go to the principle of allocating these sites as, first of all, taking them out of the greenbelt, and secondly, allocating them for an appropriate level of residential development. So it's just to make that point that any changes can't go to the soundness of the allocation as a whole.
Thank you. Are there any other points that anybody wishes to raise on policies R25 and R26? Before, Mr. Whipps, please.
I hope now is the right time just to mention this point. One of the questions you deal with is in terms of site infrastructure. Is it appropriately identified? And I think on behalf of my clients, I should just raise 2 points, because it certainly they're relevant to the overall balance and the planning judgment and whether there are exceptional circumstances. And that's 2 infrastructure matters, and they both come from the infrastructure development plan produced by the council. Firstly, in paragraph 7.11, it refers to the potential deficit in broadband coverage to the north and south of the borough, and we don't see there's any evidence to address that. And secondly, and perhaps of more concern, and it really seeks to justify the point I was making in terms of the suitability for development within Blackmore, is within education. The IDP itself acknowledges that there will be a deficit or shortage of primary school places, and indeed, as we put in our evidence, there are children now living in Blackmore who cannot get entry into Blackmore Primary School, have therefore to go to other primary schools. To put it slightly crudely, they're exported for their education, and that, in my view, is undesirable in a village location where one trying to achieve social cohesion. It is unfortunate if some can go to the village school and others can't. And looking at the IDP, there is no proposals to enhance the education provision at Blackmore, and indeed my clients don't think it has that capacity because of the site being relatively constrained. So I just wanted to draw those to your attention. I think it's important when one looks at the overall planning judgment, so to speak.
Thank you. Can I get a response from the council on the points that Mr. Whipps raised about those infrastructure issues, please?
I'm happy to come on if that's okay with.
Yes, please, Ms. Hall.
Okay, so the IDP does identify the need for financial contributions to the school capacity, and if you look at the IDP Part B, we have identified that, we have listed that, and this is in liaison with ECC, the local education authority, and we identify the need for financial contribution based on the indicative units that would be accommodated by the site on the sites. So I hope that addresses the concern raised by Mr. Whip. In terms of broadband capacity, this is something that would be considered at the planning application stage, because simply the infrastructure deficit or anything like that should be considered. It moved on quite quickly on the commercial side. So we acknowledge there is some deficits there. However, it has to be considered at the planning application stage, and it would have to comply with the policy requirements.
Just on that point, in relation to the schools, or the school, sorry, you're saying that the IDP sets out that financial contributions will be required, and obviously the council has the financial contributions policy.
Yeah.
What would that money be utilised for? I.e., can the primary school expand? Is there space? Is there, capacity for that to occur? What would that money be utilised for?
I think in conversation with the Essex County Council, it would be towards the expansion of the school.
So it would be towards the expansion. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Mr. Whips, you still got your hand up. Is that a new hand or an old hand?
No, that is a new hand this time. I've listened very carefully to what Ms. Hong has just said. I acknowledge that within the IDP there is reference to expansion, but that's not expansion on site. I believe that when they're talking about Blackmore, they're talking about expansion at Doddinghurst, and therefore a short distance away. And just to bring the importance of it is that the schools are already at capacity, and the county council talk about having a 5% surplus requirement. So to that extent, there's potential significant capacity issue there, and I believe it's ED2. It's Part B of the IDP, and there's a reference ED2, which puts expansion, a limited expansion at Doddinghurst. I have to say it was not within my gift to see whether that carried forward all the necessary pupil requirements, but I've not seen any evidence to suggest that the school at Blackmore can be expanded.
We do have a further session. Thank you for that, Mr. Whips. We do have a further session in relation to community facilities that does raise the issue of education as part of that. So it may be something that that isn't for a little while yet. It's not until next week that will be raised. So we will have a little look at that to just see if we have any further questions and whether we wish for either the county council or in terms of the education authority to be present or not. So if you leave that one with us to just understand the connotations of that, and obviously in terms of if the council wants to just respond on those points that have been raised about that this isn't an expansion of the primary school at Blackmore, it's an expansion at Doddinghurst. Is that correct? Sorry, Mr. Whips, you've still got your microphone on.
I was merely going to say thank you for drawing to our attention. You're going to consider it again on Tuesday or one day next week, and I'll look into that as well.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you. If I can just have a council response on that point that Mr. Whips has raised about this is not actually expansion at Blackmore, it's at Doddinghurst, and therefore it's that sustainable sort of travel issue, isn't it? About if you're busing children out to a different location, then does that justify further development within the village?
Yeah. So the way that the modelling, education modelling that Essex County Council does is that they look at the planning group together. So at this stage, it doesn't state whether it would be the school at Blackmore or Doddinghurst, but it would have to be at the county would look at the deficit at the time the planning applications goes forward, rather than speculate which school could have the will have that expansion, because some development in Doddinghurst may go forward first, or the Blackmore ones could go forward first. So it would have to be dealt with in time rather than speculate at this stage, if that makes sense to you. So that's my understanding. So the county probably would be able to confirm further, but that's my understanding of education planning.
Thank you.
And just to add to that, Inspector, obviously the point being is that the County Council have raised no objection to the sites in Blackmore in respect of education provision. And obviously, there's, as Ms Hong just outlined, that the response that they're given in terms of what contributions are required is determined by that planning grouping. But I do understand that we can go into more detail on that as the infrastructure session. The county may be able to provide more detail.
Okay, thank you. But what I'm hearing is that the financial contributions in terms of expansion doesn't rule out Blackmore Primary School potentially, but there isn't a definitive answer at this stage. That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you on that point. Anything further on excuse me, on sites R25 and R26. Ms. Hong, you've still got your hand up. Is that a new hand?
It's probably the old hand. Thank you.
I'll use the term, or is it a legacy hand? I prefer to use just old hand, but that's just me. Right, what I'd like to do then is have a quick break, and then we'll move on. Kelvedon Hatch won't be quite as long as this session. I do recognise that this session has been a little bit longer. I'm hoping to finish around 4:30 at the latest. If it does go on a little bit longer, then I will bring in Mr. Butcher shortly before we finish. But just to warn you, if there are any issues with anybody staying on until sort of 4:30 or 4:45, would that be an issue? Is that okay? Nobody's got sort of caring responsibilities or anything. Although most of us are in homes anyway, so it's less of an issue. Right, Mr. Butcher, please. Did you have something that you wish to comment on?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. It's just about timing. As I mentioned at the start of this session, I have Paul Gibbs here from David Jarvis Associates to deal with or assist on green belt issues in relation to Kelvedon Hatch. He has a prior commitment and he has to get away if he can by 4 o'clock, if that's possible to do so. I'm just wondering, in terms of when we turn to the questions on Kelvedon Hatch, whether we could sort of concentrate on the green belt issues in the first instance.
I am more than I was hoping on just like literally a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back. So we'll come back at 22, and then we'll go straight into the green belt issues. Would that be helpful?
Yes, that would be very helpful.
Thank you, Mr. Butcher. Thank you. So if everybody can be back at 22, please. Thank you. Right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We're now going to be discussing the two Kelvedon Hatch proposed site allocations, which are R23 and R24. Now, again, similar to Blackmore, if the council could just do a very short introduction about the sites, and then moving on to the same aspects as regards Greenbelt and the exceptional circumstances that justify the removal of those sites from the Greenbelt, and then I'll move directly over to Mr. Butcher and so that we can get a response from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Inspector. So yes, there are two proposed allocations in the village of Kelvedon Hatch, comprising site R23, Bryce's Corner Field, which is for 23 homes, and the other site is R24, Land off Stocks Lane, for approximately 30 homes. The sites themselves, obviously joining the village of Kelvedon Hatch on the southern side of the village, so not too far from each other. And they are obviously representing urban extensions to the village. In terms of the exceptional circumstances, so in terms of the sites, they were, I'll talk about them individually, but like I say, it will be similar for both. They were assessed in the Greenbelt study as having moderate impact on the Greenbelt. And I think with our view is that the residential development of these sites is considered to be appropriate to the location of the sites adjacent to the village of Kelvedon Hatch. And although development of these sites would represent a degree of urban sprawl, given the small size of the sites, they would have limited impact on the openness of the Greenbelt and its overall integrity. And also in terms of the boundaries of those sites, they're considered to represent natural fill boundaries that are appropriate in this location for release. So yeah, the allocations, apologies, I've ended up talking about both of them at the same time, but I just not to save us repeating myself, they are the same justifications for both. And so these allocations are considered to therefore be appropriate on that basis.
Thank you, Mr. Quilter. Can I bring in Mr. Butcher, please, or is it Mr. Gibbs? Who can you give me some further information in relation to why these sites and the justification in terms of exceptional circumstances for their removal from the Greenbelt, please?
If I can start this conversation on behalf of Stonebond, Ma'am, I'd simply refer you to, in general terms, to our hearing statement, where we set out our agreement with the approach to the release of the sites from the Greenbelt and the selection process that the parties have undertaken here. And those matters in general terms are dealt with at paragraph 9 in my hearing statement. In terms of the specifics on the Greenbelt, it's maybe to bring in Paul Gibbs, if I may, and he can perhaps talk more realistically and more informatively about the approach that the council have taken to the Greenbelt in this location. He's undertaken a full review of the council's background work and the evidence base in order to come to a view on this. So, Paul, over to you, if that's okay.
That'd be very useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Inspector. Mom, do you have before you our Greenbelt note as part of the Reg 19 submission?
Not in front of me.
Not in front of you. Okay. Well,
I can get it, but it will take me a little while to find it.
Well, everything that I'm about to say is captured in that note. If you care to look at it later.
I want to go through that, and then I'll
yes,
pull it,
absolutely.
I will pull it up. Yeah.
Just to follow on from what Mr. Quilter was saying and what Mr. Butcher was saying, we are entirely behind the council and their approach to the assessment of the Greenbelt that they've undertaken, and agree with their overall conclusions on the effect that the development of the sites would have on the Greenbelt. Taking the two sites one at a time, I think it's Stocks Lane first. The boundaries are well defined, as you would have seen if you've been on site. Existing hedgerows.
I have listed the sites, yes.
Yes, and there's a right of way that runs diagonally through the site, which would be retained as proposed in the vision statement prepared by Stonebond. So I think the boundaries are they are clearly defined on the ground and wouldn't represent a significant incursion into the countryside, as Mr. Quilter would have said. In regard to other effects upon the green belt, there would be no reduction in the countryside gap, limited impact on the countryside itself, no effect on the special character of any historic towns, and therefore we support their conclusion that its development would make a moderate contribution to an effect on the green belt. Turning to R23 in reverse order, because it's slightly more subtle perhaps. The wider area around R23, there's an area of land to the west of the allocation which, taken in the round, is contained by very well developed woodland and tree lines to the east and the south, with existing development to the north and the east. The boundary of the allocation currently is defined by a fairly young hedge that runs across the centre of the site. You'll see in the various representations that we have made on behalf of Stonebond that there is a proposal to enlarge the allocation somewhat to better reflect the form of development to the north of Blackmore Road. Having said that, if that was to come forward, then compensatory open space would be offered, as is reflected in document F59 in the settlement hierarchy, in that there is a distinct lack of good quality public open space, play space within the village. So that would help to address that deficiency to a degree. Because of its very well enclosed nature, we see that there's, again, we're consistent with the council's findings on that particular site, that there would be a moderate effect on the green belt should it come forward for development. There's just possibly a wider opportunity perhaps to deliver more homes in that location, given its very well screened and very well enclosed nature.
Can I just understand this point? Because obviously we're not dealing with any emission sites, and I'm quite strict on that point. Expanding a site to provide further public open space, or to include a woodland that needs proper management or whatever, which I have allowed in the past, then that would be acceptable. Expanding a site to allow further housing, that's an emission site. That's an additional emission site on top of. So I really don't want to have those discussions, because it would only be up to us as inspectors if we find that the council does need to provide further sites. Then that's certainly something the council may then wish to come to you and discuss those matters. But it's certainly not anything that. So can I just understand, are you talking about expanding the site because it's necessary to provide public open space as
Not
part of the development? No, it's not.
No, as it stands at the moment, it's entirely appropriate.
Okay, right. Thank you. Thank you for that clarity. That's really useful. Anything further on Greenbelt? So in relation to the Greenbelt boundaries, obviously I've looked at the sites. So yes. The R23 site, which is the Bryce's Corner Field site. Yes. In terms of the defensibility of that boundary.
In as much as it is a more recently planted hedgeline, it exists on the ground and it's a clear feature in the landscape.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Anything further on Greenbelt that you want to highlight?
I don't think so, Mum, unless I'm about to be prompted by Mr. Butcher.
Mum, if I could just draw your attention to the vision documents that were accompanying the statements of common ground, if this is of assistance to you. Within those vision documents are extracts from the work that Mr. Gibbs has undertaken for us in assessing suitability here, where he's gone through the purposes of Greenbelt and how these sites...
I have read those, I just don't happen to have them up at the moment. So if you want to just direct me to certain parts of that, I can certainly get those up again, but I won't do it now, but I can do it after this session.
Ma'am, I'm content for you to look at those
I'll go back and have a look at those. Yeah, but I have seen those. But thank you for highlighting that again. But thank you. Can I have? Does council want to add anything to what Mr. Butcher and Mr. Gibbs has said in relation to Greenbelt from the council's perspective?
Thank you, Inspector. No, I think obviously from our position, both the site allocations as proposed are a deliverable prospect and represent appropriate boundaries in terms of the release of Greenbelt.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So if we can start to look at the capacity then. Sorry, Mr. Gibbs, I know you need to leave shortly. Is there anything further that you wish to add?
I don't think so, Ma'am. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your input. If we can look at site capacity then, please, and understanding the council's approach. Again, very similar format to the discussions on Blackmore, because of the submitted plan, including the addendum of focus changes. Oh no, there aren't changes, are there, to Kelvedon Hatch? So that's fine. I'm thinking of Blackmore again. So can I just go through and understand the densities and the capacities of the sites that have been put forward? And just explain in terms of, again, the locality and understanding how that fits with the character of the area. I know we haven't got anybody present here today who's arguing against what's been set out in the actual policy itself, but I just want to understand the reasoning behind the capacities that have been set. Again, because there are much higher capacity in terms of density levels. So can you just explain your reasoning behind the densities that have been applied? Because there is a difference between R23 and R24 in terms of the density levels. So can you just explain that?
Yes, thank you, Inspector. Yes, as you rightfully point out, the Matters 7G hearing statement sets out in paragraph 6 that the density of R23 is 29 dwellings per hectare and R24 is 18 dwellings per hectare. Again, I suppose it's probably linking it back to the HELA in terms of as these sites have been brought forwards, obviously reflecting at the time what the site promoters felt was an appropriate level of development that could come forward in those locations. And whilst they are different, I think obviously we do reflect in the statements of common ground that obviously, as with other sites, that because the policy does not ultimately restrict those numbers, that there is the potential, more so for R24, of a potentially higher quantum coming forwards, but still being at a density akin to the local area. Obviously, as we mentioned earlier, in terms of the village location, I think we have to be mindful of obviously not having extremely high densities in those locations, but I think it's still within the broad parameters of what the HELA was setting out in terms of those ranges of what could come forwards and could be deliverable, and certainly reflective of development in the surrounding area of Kelvedon Hatch.
Thank you. Mr. Butcher, obviously, Stone Bond has in their submissions set out that they consider that the capacity of the sites could be higher. In relation to what the council's just said, that the policies stipulate around rather than a specific number, and that consideration could be made at planning application stage for higher numbers or lower numbers depending on which site they're considering. Because obviously I'm aware that you've put in, obviously in your hearing statement, you consider the site could be higher. Is there anything further you want to discuss on that point? Do you want to respond to the council's point about there is a degree of flexibility within the policies themselves anyway in relation to site capacity? Or is your client really concerned about that?
Ma'am, I think what we've heard from the council is helpful, and obviously I'm aware of the discussions in relation to density issues that have taken place elsewhere as part of the examination. We have, as you quite rightly point out, set out the basis upon which we think particularly the site at Stocks Lane can take more homes. Indeed, again, I'd refer you to the vision statement that accompanies the statement of common ground, and you can see that my clients have invested time and thought as to how the site could be brought forward, and have illustrated by a master plan how that could fit in with the local area. So as I say, in general terms, I do accept and understand the council's approach and what has been said in relation to the flexibility. I think I am just a little bit nervous that we seem to be a little way off on Stocks Lane as to what that site could potentially accommodate. I mean, the density that we've got there, I think is 14 dwellings per hectare. Clearly that's some way off the policy relating to density elsewhere in the plan, which requires densities of around 35 dph. Nevertheless, we're also mindful of the fact that take on board the comments that Mr. Quilter has made and about village character. This may not be a site that's suitable for that amount of homes, but we do take issue potentially with the fact that, as stated at the moment, the numbers that are being suggested isn't what the site is capable of. I think my fear on this point, Ma'am, is really, okay, there is flexibility on numbers, understand that, but as we know, when plans become adopted and a number appears in the plan, there will be some expectation, particularly in terms of the local area, that is what is a maximum. And I think it may be that consideration might need to be given, and I haven't really given much thought to this, I hasten to add, that if the council are going to take an approach that the numbers could be higher, they could be lower, that might be expressed elsewhere in the plan or in relation to the density policy to cover the point, because as I say, it's clear to me that Stocks Lane could accommodate more homes, and I would think that it would be beneficial, A, in terms of the housing numbers overall, to the council in terms of being on an allocated site, but I think we've also sought to demonstrate, as I say, within the vision document, that we could actually bring forward a development there that would be entirely suitable having regard to local character. So in a long-winded way, in principle, okay, with the council's stance, but as I say, I do have some nervousness, particularly about Stocks Lane, about the numbers that is being suggested in the plan.
Thank you. Council, you've obviously intimated that this comes from the indicative figures that were in the HELA and what was assessed through that process. As part of that was, and again, this is very similar to the discussions we had on Blackmore, the locality in terms of the densities. I know there isn't, you're not proposing a reduction, or you didn't as part of the focused changes produce a reduction in numbers or anything here, but could you, again, you're looking at Blackmore in terms of density, could you just give us an indication when you can as to what the density requirements are on that?
Yep, that's fine. Just one thing quickly,
just to assist us with the village location, because there's only 4 village locations, so site allocations.
Provide that as one document.
That would be really useful just to understand that. Thank you.
Okay. Just one point quickly, if it provides any reassurance to Mr. Butcher, but the in the chapter 9 at the beginning of paragraph 9.2, part A, it does give a bit of a description. I appreciate this isn't policy, but certainly contextual. It just sort of sets out in terms of the amount and type of development that explains that the numbers within the policy set out an approximate number of new homes considered appropriate for a site according to certain characteristics, such as surrounding density and character, and the amount of land considered to be developable, excluding the bracketed area. The number of new homes on the site is indicative, and in each case the council will consider the need to maximise development according to policies within the plan. And so that's what obviously we've tried to account for on that side of it, but happy for any other suggestions if there is need to amend elsewhere, but I think that's probably appropriate.
Mr. Butcher, does that give you an element of comfort that there is already something in the plan? Obviously, I will await the understanding on the densities in Kelvedon Hatch and around the or certainly adjacent to the locations, etc., to understand that. But does that give you an element of comfort that there is something actually written in the plan already?
Yes, ma'am, that does. So thank you, Mr. Coulter, for that. Didn't have the plan in front of me, so thank you. On the point, as I say, the issue here is principally about or going back to the original basis for these figures, the HELA. Clearly, since the HELA was prepared, we have, for several occasions during the plan process, suggested that the site could accommodate more homes. So I think it would be helpful if we're going away again to look at what the sites can accommodate. If I could ask Mr. Quilter again just to look at what we have submitted as part of our representations, which I would like to believe are realistic and justifiable in this location. Thank you.
Well, on that basis, well, I'll start with the council first, but if you can give me an indication of an update on the planning status of these sites, and it could be that Mr. Butcher needs to come in on this to just explain where the land promoter is going on for these sites. Mr. Quilter, can you just give me an understanding of what's happening? Is there any pre-app or any planning applications in on these sites?
So there has been some pre-app sort of high level, which has informed those vision documents to some extent in terms of the constraints on the sites. Obviously, the point in respect of expanding site R23 is obviously an outstanding matter between us. But yes, there's certainly in terms of the work that's been ongoing as we understand it, and I'll let Mr. Butcher elaborate further, but obviously that has been undertaken in terms of getting an understanding of the general constraints on sites and any barriers to development, which we understand that there are none.
Mr. Butcher, can I ask you a very similar question in terms of the, when do your clients propose to submit planning applications, etc., should these should this plan go forward, etc.?
Yes, ma'am, we're raring to go, in a word. We've done most of the technical work that would support an application. We would expect to come forward with a full application. We've undertaken a raft of studies that deal with most, if not all, technical issues. We would probably need another pre-application with the council once we're clearer about the potential numbers that could be achieved from both sites. But other than that, as I say, we are in a position to bring forward an application, if not before adoption of the plan. Certainly, we could potentially bring it forward before adoption with a view to it, if the plan is adopted, being taken forward for planning permission soon afterwards. But we are thereabouts, quite frankly, in being able to promote full planning applications for both sites. And again, the vision documents, ma'am, give some indication of the technical work that has been undertaken to date to support our proposals. So I'm confident, and with Stonebond, who are an established developer of sites of this size, as I say, they are ready to go. Again, the vision document gives you an indication of other sites that they have brought forward elsewhere of a similar size and character. So it's really just hopefully, fingers crossed, getting the plan across the line, and we're good to go.
And in relation to your concerns about the development capacity for the sites, are there any issues around viability as to why your client is promoting higher numbers, etc.? Are there concerns relating to that? I'm not saying that there are, and nothing's been highlighted in that case, but I just wanted to clarify.
Statement of common ground confirms that whatever density we go at, so long as it's no lower than that has been described in the local plan, these sites are perfectly viable and deliverable.
Thank you. That helps to just get clarity. And as the council has said, there's no, and certainly from the evidence that we've seen, there doesn't appear to be anything before us to say that there are any particular site constraints or barriers to delivery. That's the case from your perspective, Mr. Butcher.
It is indeed. We've undertaken all the necessary initial work in terms of understanding access to the site. We've undertaken the surveys in relation to ecology. We have said that it's in flood zone 1, so there are no overriding constraints that prevent delivery. And one would expect to be able to deal with certain detailed site-specific matters at the planning application stage. So, as I say, there's nothing that would prevent the sites coming forward now.
Okay. Thank you. There is just a final point that I wanted to just bring to attention before then. Just quickly looking at some of the suggested changes that Mr. Butcher, your clients have put into the hearing statement. So I want to quickly go through that wording. But in your submissions, you've wanted or have requested some clarity on the requirements that are set out in the supporting text. Now, this isn't in relation to mitigating local and strategic road network. Now, it's not anything that's been brought forward in the statements of common ground. So it's not set out in there as outstanding matter, etc. So is that something that's still sort of outstanding, or do you feel that that's been covered adequately by the council?
We're satisfied that it has been covered by the council, and again, hopefully the statement of common ground gives you comfort on that point.
Thank you. I just wanted clarity because the hearing statement was saying one thing, and then the statement of common ground, which is obviously the most recent document, was not highlighting that. So thank you for that clarity. That's really useful. So in relation to the suggested changes in the wording that was set out in the hearing statement, is that no longer the case because that's not set out in your statement of common ground with the council? So I don't need to go through that.
No, I don't think so. Obviously, what I said in the hearing statement was...
That was a while ago, wasn't it? Or it seems like it was a while ago. Yes.
It was a while ago, and obviously it also deals with the point that we've talked about already, which is a possible extension to the site. But clearly, as you say, these were a while ago, and I don't believe there's any further changes that now that need to be made in the light of what we've agreed in the statement of common ground.
Thank you. I don't have any further questions on this. Mr. Warden, do you have any questions for Kelvedon Hatch sites?
I don't. Right, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So unless there's anything else that anybody wants to bring in, I'd like to bring this session to a close. So thank you very much for your contributions. We'll obviously take on board what's been said and obviously make our decisions in relation to where we go from here for these sites. Thank you very much, and we will be back on at 9:30 tomorrow morning, whoever is coming along to that session. So thank you very much for your contributions. Thank you.
Thank you.